England in 878 was not the powerful kingdom people imagine today. There were no stone castles, no knights in plate armor, no great cathedrals with stained glass rising above crowded cities. That England did not exist yet. It would not exist for centuries. The England of 878 was a land of wooden halls, muddy tracks, smoking hearths, scattered farms, and constant fear. Most of its kingdoms had already fallen to the Vikings. The north was gone. The east was gone. The midlands had crumbled. Only Wessex in the south still held, and barely. While King Alfred fought to hold his world together, ordinary people still had to bake bread, tend animals, pray, repair roofs, and sleep each night, not knowing what might come from the horizon. This is what England was really like under Alfred. Not the legend, but the real world that ordinary people lived in. We are going to walk through Alfred's England step by step. First, we will see the land itself, the villages, the tracks, the rivers, and the scattered settlements where most people spent their entire lives. Then, we will step inside their homes, sit by their fires, and see what daily life actually looked and felt like for an ordinary Anglo-Saxon family. Then, we will look at the things that made this world real, the food they ate, the clothes they wore, the work that filled their hands from dawn to dark. And finally, we will feel the shadow that hung over all of it, the fear, the faith, and the threat of the Vikings that shaped every decision, every prayer, and every sleepless night. To understand what life was like in 878, you first have to understand what kind of place England was. It was not one country. It was a patchwork, a collection of kingdoms, each with its own king, its own customs, its own sense of identity. And by 878, most of those kingdoms had been destroyed. The great heathen army, the massive Viking force that had landed in East Anglia in 865, had swept through Britain in a little over a decade. Northumbria had fallen. East Anglia had been conquered. Mercia, the great kingdom of central England, had been reduced to a shadow of itself, its eastern half under Viking rule, its western rump clinging to survival under Alfred's protection. The Danelaw, the vast area of England under Viking control, now covered the north and the east. Danish settlers were farming land that had been Anglo-Saxon for generations. Danish lords sat in halls where English thegns had once held court. Danish place names were replacing English ones. The boundary was not always a clear line on the ground, but everyone knew which side of it they lived on. And everyone knew what had happened to the people who had tried to resist. Only Wessex remained free. Wessex stretched across the south of England, from the marshes of Somerset in the west to the borders of Kent in the east. Its heartland was chalk downland, river valleys, and oak forests. Its capital, such as it was Winchester, a town of perhaps 3,000 or 4,000 people enclosed by old Roman walls that had been repaired and strengthened by Alfred's engineers. But Winchester was not a grand city. It was a working town. Timber houses packed tight inside Roman stone walls, muddy streets, market stalls, a modest cathedral, a royal compound where Alfred held court, heard cases, and planned the defense of a kingdom that was surrounded on 3 sides by enemies. Beyond Winchester, Wessex was overwhelmingly rural. Small villages, isolated farms, scattered hamlets connected by tracks that turned to mud in the rain and dust in the summer. The Roman roads were still there, crumbling, overgrown in places, but still the best routes across the landscape. Everything else was a path worn by feet and hooves through fields and woodland. This was the England that Alfred was trying to hold together. not a nation in any modern sense, not a state with borders and bureaucracy, a fragile collection of communities held together by loyalty, by the church, by shared language, and by the simple fact that the alternative was submission to the Danes. And for the ordinary people living in that world, the farmers, the craftsmen, the women grinding grain and mending cloth, the children tending pigs in the woodland, the great political struggles of kings and warlords were distant, abstract, almost irrelevant. What mattered to them was the harvest, the weather, the health of their animals, the roof that needed patching before the rains came, the bread that had to be baked, the fire that had to be kept alive, and the question that never quite went away: would the Vikings come this year? If you were transported to the England of 878, the first thing you would notice is how empty it was. The population of all England in the late 9th century was probably somewhere between 1 and 2 million people. The landscape that today holds 67 million was, in Alfred's time, a vast patchwork of forest, marsh, heath, and open farmland, interrupted only occasionally by the signs of human habitation. Villages were small. A typical Anglo-Saxon settlement might have 10 or 15 households, perhaps 50 to 80 people in total. The houses clustered together in a loose group, surrounded by fields that stretched outward in long open strips. There were no hedgerows dividing them, no stone walls. The fields were communal, worked by the village together under a system of shared obligation and custom. The houses themselves were built of timber, wattle, and daub, a frame of oak posts with walls made from woven hazel or willow rods plastered over with a thick mixture of clay, straw, and animal dung. The roofs were thatched, heavy bundles of straw or reeds packed tight and sloping steeply to shed the rain. From the outside, an Anglo-Saxon house looked low, dark, and rough. From the inside, it felt even smaller. A single room, perhaps 20 feet long and 12 feet wide, dominated by a central hearth. The fire pit sat on the beaten earth floor, ringed with stones. Smoke rose from the burning wood and drifted upward through the thatch because there was no chimney. The rafters were black, with soot. The air was thick and warm and stung the eyes. Light came from the fire and from the doorway. Windows, if they existed at all, were small openings covered with oiled linen or wooden shutters. When the door was closed and the shutters drawn, the interior was dim even at midday. Around the walls, low wooden benches served as seats, workspaces, and beds. A few storage chests held clothing, tools, and whatever small valuables the family owned. Pots, pans, and cooking implements hung from pegs or sat on the floor near the hearth. The floor itself was packed earth, sometimes covered with rushes or straw that grew dirty and damp and had to be replaced. Outside the house, the village had a rhythm and a shape that had been the same for generations. A small church stood somewhere near the centre, or what passed for a centre. Not a grand building, a simple structure of timber, perhaps with a stone foundation if the village was prosperous, with a thatched roof and a wooden cross above the door. The church was the heart of the community. Births, marriages, deaths, holy days, disputes, and confessions, all of them passed through this building. Beyond the church, a few common structures served the village: a well or a spring, a common oven where bread was baked, perhaps a small forge where a local smith repaired tools and sharpened blades. Animal pens stood at the edges of the settlement, keeping livestock close enough to guard but far enough to manage the smell, though in practice the smell was everywhere. The tracks between villages were not roads, they were paths, worn into the earth by years of use, widened by cart wheels, and narrowed again by rain. In summer, they were passable. In autumn and winter, they became rivers of mud. Travel was slow, difficult, and often dangerous, not because of bandits, though those existed, but because of the sheer physical difficulty of moving through a landscape without paved surfaces, bridges, or signposts. Rivers were the best highways: the Thames, the Severn, the Avon, the Stour. These were the routes that connected communities, carried goods, and made trade possible. Small boats moved up and down the waterways carrying grain, wool, timber, salt, and iron. A journey that might take days on foot could be done in hours by water. The towns were few and small: Winchester, Exeter, Bath, Wareham. These were the largest settlements in Wessex, and none of them held more than a few thousand people. Most were built within old Roman walls. The Anglo-Saxons had not built walls of their own until Alfred began his program of fortified towns, the burhs, which in 878 was still in its early stages. A town like Winchester had a market, a mint, workshops for craftsmen, and a church or two. Its streets were laid out more formally than a village, but they were still muddy, narrow, and crowded with animals, carts, and people. The houses were timber, packed close together, with workshops opening directly onto the street. Beyond the towns and villages, the landscape was wild. Dense forests of oak, ash, and elm covered much of England. Marshes and wetlands spread across the lowlands, the Somerset levels, the fens of East Anglia, the river floodplains that turned to shallow lakes every winter. Heathland and rough pasture filled the spaces between settlements. This was not a tamed landscape. It was a landscape that people lived in carefully, always aware of how much of it was beyond their control. If this kind of reconstruction is something you value, subscribing to Walter Reconstructs History is the best way to make sure the next one happens. Every video takes weeks of research, writing, and production, and your subscription tells me that this work matters. If you have been watching this far, you already care about history done properly. That means a lot. Now, let us step inside the home. The day began before the sun rose. In a village house in Wessex, the first person awake was usually a woman. She rose from the bench where she had slept, wrapped in a woolen blanket, and knelt by the hearth to coax the banked embers back to life. A handful of dried grass, a few small sticks, then larger pieces of wood carefully placed until the flame caught and the smoke began to rise again into the thatch above. The fire was everything. It was warmth, it was light, it was the only way to cook food. Letting a fire go out overnight was not just careless, it was a disaster, because starting a new one from scratch with flint and steel and dried tinder could take a long time. And in midwinter, every moment without heat was dangerous. Once the fire was burning, the first task was water. The nearest source might be a well, a spring, or the edge of a stream. Water was carried back in wooden buckets, heavy and awkward, slung over the shoulder or gripped in both hands. In winter, the ground was frozen, the paths were treacherous, and the water itself was painfully cold. Breakfast was simple: a porridge of oats or barley boiled in water or thin ale, sometimes with a handful of dried herbs or a scrap of hard cheese stirred in. Bread left over from the day before, if there was any, torn into pieces and eaten with the porridge. There was no sugar, no tea, no coffee. The drink was ale, weak, cloudy, slightly sour, brewed at home and consumed by everyone, including children, because the water was often unsafe. After the morning meal, the work began. And it did not stop until the light failed. For the men, work meant the land, ploughing in spring with a heavy wooden plough pulled by oxen, sowing seed by hand, broadcasting it across the furrows, weeding through the summer, harvesting in late summer and early autumn, cutting the grain with sickles, binding it into sheaves and carrying it to the threshing floor. In winter, when the fields were dormant, there was still no rest. Fences needed mending, tools needed repairing, firewood needed cutting. Animals needed feeding, watering, and watching. The animals were central to survival. Cattle provided milk, leather, and eventually meat, though a farmer would not slaughter a healthy cow unless he had to. Cattle were too valuable alive. Sheep provided wool, which was essential for clothing and trade. Pigs foraged in the woodland, eating acorns and roots, and were the most common source of meat. Chickens and geese provided eggs. Bees provided honey, the only sweetener available. For the women, the work was equally relentless and equally vital. Grinding grain was a daily task. The quern, two flat stones, one turning on top of the other, sat in almost every household. Grain was poured in at the top and ground by hand into coarse flour. It was exhausting, monotonous work, and the grit from the stones wore into the flour and, over years, wore down the teeth of everyone who ate the bread made from it. Bread was baked most days. The dough was shaped by hand and baked in a clay oven or on a flat stone near the fire. The bread was dark, dense and heavy, made from barley, rye or oats, rarely from wheat, which was expensive and not widely grown. It was the foundation of every meal. Beyond bread, the food of ordinary people was simple and repetitive. Pottage, a thick stew of whatever vegetables were available, was the staple. Onions, leeks, cabbages, beans, peas, turnips, and parsnips went into the pot. In a good season, some meat might be added, a piece of salted pork, a smoked fish, a rabbit caught in the woodland. In a bad season, the pottage was thin, and the portions were small. Cheese was made from sheep's milk or cow's milk and eaten throughout the year. Fish, freshwater fish, from rivers and ponds, salted or smoked sea fish from the coast, was an important part of the diet, especially during the many fast days required by the church. The clothing of ordinary people was practical and rough. Wool was the dominant fabric. Women spun raw wool into thread, using a drop spindle, a weighted stick that twisted the fibers as it turned, and wove the thread into cloth on upright looms that stood against the wall of the house. The rhythm of the loom weights clicking was one of the constant sounds of domestic life. Men wore a long tunic of wool or linen belted at the waist, with loose trousers bound at the calf, with strips of cloth or leather. Over the tunic, a cloak of heavier wool fastened at the shoulder with a brooch or pin. On their feet, leather shoes or boots stitched by hand and rarely waterproof. On their heads, a hood or a simple cap. Women wore a long undergown of linen covered by an outer gown of wool, belted or clasped at the waist. A head covering, a length of cloth wrapped around the hair, was standard. Brooches, pins, and simple belt fittings were the only decoration most women owned. The colours were muted. Natural wool ranged from cream to brown to dark grey. Dyes existed, wode for blue, weld for yellow, madder for red, but brightly dyed cloth was expensive and usually reserved for the wealthy. Most people wore the colours of the sheep that had grown the wool. Leather was everywhere. Belts, pouches, knife sheaths, shoes, harnesses, buckets, and straps. A small utility knife hung from almost every belt, not a weapon, but an essential tool for the 100 small cutting tasks that filled a working day. The houses smelled of smoke, of damp wool, of animal fat, of the earthy sweetness of drying herbs, and of the less pleasant odours of bodies, animals, and the refuse pit behind the house. Privacy did not exist. Families slept, ate, worked, argued and prayed in a single room, within arm's reach of each other, within earshot of the neighbours, within sight of the animals penned just outside the door. This was not poverty as modern people understand it. It was simply life. The only life that anyone in a Saxon village had ever known or could imagine. If you asked an ordinary person in Alfred's England what mattered most in their life, the answer would not have been the king. It would not have been politics or war or the fate of kingdoms. It would have been God and fear. The two were inseparable. Christianity had been the faith of the Anglo-Saxons for over 2 centuries by 878. The old pagan gods, Woden, Thunor, Tiw, survived in place names and in the days of the week, but they were memories, not living beliefs. The church was the centre of every community. The priest was the most important figure in the village after the Lord. The rhythm of the church calendar, Advent, Christmas, Lent, Easter, the feast days of saints, structured the entire year. People went to church not because it was pleasant, but because it was essential. The priest baptized their children, blessed their crops, heard their confessions, married them, buried them, and told them what God expected. And what God expected in the teaching of the 9th century church was obedience, humility, prayer, and the avoidance of sin. The punishments for failure were not abstract. Hell was real. The devil was real. The judgment that waited after death was as certain as the harvest. The village church was simple: timber walls, a thatched roof, a rough wooden altar, a cross. In larger settlements or monasteries there might be a stone church, but these were rare outside the towns. Inside, the space was bare. No pews. People stood or knelt on the earth floor. A few candles on the altar, perhaps a crude painting on the wall showing a saint or a scene from scripture. The services were in Latin, which almost no one in the congregation understood, but the rituals were familiar, comforting, and woven so deeply into daily life that their meaning was felt rather than analysed. Monks and clergy in the larger centres, Winchester, Glastonbury, Sherborne, kept the intellectual life of the church alive. They copied manuscripts by candlelight in cold scriptoria. They maintained libraries of books that had been gathered over generations. They taught reading and writing to the sons of nobles and to the boys who would become priests. Alfred himself was deeply invested in this work. He believed that learning had collapsed in England, and he was right. By 878, literacy outside the monasteries was almost non-existent. But for most people, faith was not intellectual. It was practical. You prayed for rain, you prayed for health, you prayed for your animals, your children, your crops. You prayed that the winter would not kill you, that the harvest would not fail, and that the Vikings would not come. The Vikings. The fear was not constant in the way that a war zone is constant. It was more like living near a volcano. The eruption might not come this year, it might not come next year, but it had come before, and everyone knew it could come again at any time. In villages near the Danelaw border, in northern Wessex, in the western edges of Mercia, the fear was immediate. Raiding parties could appear with little warning. A few longships on the river, a column of armed men on the road, the smoke of a burning farm on the horizon. The response was flight. Most villages had no defences. There were no walls, no towers, no garrison. The people simply ran into the woods, into the marshes, toward the nearest fortified place, if one existed. They took what they could carry: children, a bag of grain, a tool, a blanket. Everything else was left behind. Alfred was building a system to change this. The burhs, fortified towns surrounded by earthen ramparts and timber palisades, were being planned and, in some places, already under construction. The idea was simple. No one in Wessex should be more than a day's march from a defended settlement where they could shelter during a raid. But in 878, the system was not yet complete. Many villages had nowhere to go. Even in places far from the frontier, the fear shaped behavior. Travelers brought rumors. A merchant from the east might mention that the Danes were restless. A monk returning from a pilgrimage might report what he had seen in the occupied territories: churches burned, monasteries looted, communities scattered. At night, in the villages, men talked about defense. Who had weapons? A spear, passed down from a father, a shield, round and wooden, with an iron boss, a seax, the broad, single-edged knife that gave the Anglo-Saxons their name. These were not soldiers' weapons, they were farmers' weapons, kept by the door, sharpened when the rumors grew louder and hoped never to be needed. Watchmen were posted at the edges of settlements during times of heightened tension. A man standing on a hill at dawn, scanning the horizon for movement. A boy sent to climb a tree near the river to watch for sails. A woman keeping the fire burning low at night, so that the smoke would not give away the village's location. The sound of the church bell at the wrong hour was the most feared sound in the village. 1 ring meant prayer. 3 rings, fast and urgent, meant danger. And when the danger came, there was no system, no protocol, no organized response. There was only the terrible, familiar ritual of grabbing what you could and running. Families separated in the chaos, a mother losing a child in the woodland, a father staying behind to buy time. Some people hid in ditches, in haystacks, in the hollows of ancient trees. Some were caught. Some were never seen again. This was what the Viking threat meant for ordinary people. Not a battle on a distant field, not a story told by a poet in a king's hall. A sound in the night, a column of smoke, a decision made in seconds that determined whether you and your family survived. Alfred understood this. His entire program of defense, the burhs, the reformed fyrd, the network of beacons and messengers, was built on the understanding that the people of Wessex could not live forever in fear. They needed walls. They needed warning. They needed to believe that someone, somewhere, was working to protect them. But in 878, that work was still beginning. And for most people in Alfred's England, the fear was still the loudest thing in the room. To live in Alfred's England was to live in a world still unfinished. The kingdom was not yet a nation, the borders were not yet fixed, the laws were not yet written, though Alfred was already beginning to write them. The schools were not yet built, though Alfred was already planning them. The language itself was still shifting, still absorbing new words and new sounds, still becoming the English that would one day be spoken across the world. Alfred's contribution was not a single moment of triumph. It was a slow, grinding, unglamorous process of building. While the people of Wessex baked bread and mended fences and prayed and feared and survived, their king was doing something that very few rulers in the 9th century attempted. He was organizing. The burhs were not just fortresses, they were planned towns, laid out with streets and market spaces, designed to attract settlers, to encourage trade, and to create the economic base that would sustain a permanent defense. Each burh had a garrison drawn from the surrounding countryside. Each household in Wessex owed a certain number of men to the local burh. The The system was not perfect, and it was not completed during Alfred's lifetime, but it was the beginning of something that had not existed before: a national defence. The fyrd, the militia of free men, was reformed, instead of calling up every able-bodied man at once, which left the farms unworked and the villages undefended. Alfred divided the obligation. Half the men served while the other half stayed home. This meant that Wessex could maintain a fighting force in the field for longer periods without starving its own population. Alfred also invested in learning. He invited scholars from Mercia, from Wales, from the continent. He personally translated Latin texts into Old English, an extraordinary act for a king, and one that tells us something about the man. He believed that the collapse of learning in England was not just a cultural loss, but a strategic one. A kingdom that could not read its own laws, could not record its own history, and could not educate its own priests was a kingdom that would not survive. He founded schools. He established a court that valued literacy. He created a written law code that drew on the traditions of earlier Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and on the Bible, and he distributed it across Wessex so that justice would be consistent and visible. None of this was dramatic. None of it made for exciting storytelling. No scop would sing a song about a king who reorganized the militia rota or translated a Latin text into the vernacular. But it was this work, quiet, persistent, unglamorous, that turned Wessex from a kingdom fighting for survival into a kingdom capable of enduring. And it was this foundation that Alfred's children and grandchildren would build upon, expanding Wessex into Mercia, into East Anglia, into Northumbria, until, by the middle of the 10th century, there was, for the first time, something that could reasonably be called England. The people who baked bread in 878 did not know this. The woman spinning wool by her fire did not know that she lived in the year a nation was being born. The farmer mending his fence in the rain did not know that the king who taxed his grain was also building the idea of a country. They only knew the work in front of them: the bread, the fire, the children, the prayer, and the hope, faint, stubborn, and never quite spoken aloud, that this winter might be the last one they had to endure alone. Under Alfred, England was still being made. For most people, history did not arrive as a grand speech or a famous victory. It arrived as hunger, as prayer, as labor, as rumor, and as survival. The great events that we read about in books, the battles, the treaties, the crownings, were distant echoes in a world where the most important question was whether the bread would last until spring. And yet, from that harsh and uncertain world, something enduring began to take shape. Not because a single king willed it, but because thousands of ordinary people, people whose names were never recorded, whose faces were never painted, whose stories were never told, did what people have always done. They got up in the morning, they lit the fire, they fed the children, they worked until the light failed, and they refused, quietly and without drama, to let their world disappear. This was not yet the England of castles and cathedrals, of parliaments and empire. It was smaller, rougher, more fragile, and more human. To live in Alfred's England was to live in a world still unfinished, half survival, half beginning. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoy this kind of deep historical reconstruction, please subscribe to Walter Reconstructs History. I make videos that bring lost kingdoms, decisive moments, and great turning points back to life in a way that is simple, visual, and grounded in real history. And if there is another lost city, forgotten battle, or vanished world you want to see rebuilt, leave it in the comments. What should I reconstruct next on Walter Reconstructs History?